所以当然我刚才讨论奥运会，奥运会原来大家都应该知道是古希腊发明的，对不对？所以我们下一步我们要开始讨论下个题目。到现在为止，你记得我们的课，我们说是不同的争论。第一是我们讨论的是自由与和谐的争论，然后我们讨论平等与等级的一些争论，都很重要。从现在开始，最后个题目我们要讨论是民主与贤能政治的争论。在西方的国家跟中国完全不一样，西方的国家有2500年的一些关于民主思想的争论，当然是从古希腊开始，所以我们先要从古希腊开始讨论。在中国讨论民主只有100多年的历史，150年的历史，但是大部分的学者都在讨论贤能政治的一些问题，怎么选拔，怎么提拔比较优秀的领导，这个在中国有2500多年的争论。我们先讨论民主方面好吗？然后我们会讨论贤能政治。我们开始讨论民主，一定要从古希腊开始好吗？因为古希腊，尤其是 Athens is, now I switch to English, is the birthplace of democracy. And what was so fascinating about Athens, what it gave birth to, is not so much the idea of democracy, but rather the institutions of democracy. All the democratic institutions, almost all that we know of today, came from a little tiny city-state over 2,500 years ago in Athens. But the philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, were very critical of democracy, as we'll see. So what's interesting about ancient Greece is that it provided many of the institutions of democracy for the rest of the world, and some of the arguments against democracy by the great philosophers, especially Plato and Aristotle. So what we will do is first discuss the birthplace of democracy, Athens, and we will ask why democracy originated in this tiny little city-state, and why it provided so many different kinds of institutions of democracy, and also why it was quite successful at maintaining democratic institutions. It's a fascinating question because it's strange that a tiny little city-state would be so influential for the rest of the world. There's one important tension that I want you to notice, and it took different forms in Western societies and in China historically. In China, there's been always a tension between emphasis on family and aristocracy, right? 家庭、贵族等等, and 法家, right? The first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huangdi, he wanted to destroy the family and the clans that had power to establish a strong, unified state, right? And much of Chinese history is a tension between emphasis on this and emphasis on that, at least until the 20th century. In the West, it's a different tension. It's been a tension between the family and aristocracy and a kind of democracy. And we're going to see that to build up a democracy in ancient Athens required an attack, a challenge on family and aristocracy. So in both cases, you had to challenge family and aristocracy, the power of the family, and the power of aristocratic clans. But in the West, at least I'm simplifying, but not that much, in ancient Greece, we'll see, in ancient Athens, it was to establish more democracy, more power to the people. Democracy, the term, whereas in China, it was more to establish legalism until recently. The term democracy, let me just be a bit more clear and then we'll come back to it. It comes from ancient Greece, of course, right? Demokratia, and it means people power, giving power to the people. So in the West, we already discussed this a little bit, the way that democracy, the term democracy, basically means power by the people. Government by the people, not necessarily government for the people. Because remember, in John Stuart Mill, he said you can have an enlightened dictator who serves the people, right? It doesn't have to come from the people. But to be a democracy, at least in the typical understanding in Western political thought and in people's minds today in the West, it means power or government by the people. In China, it's different. If you ask typical, 如果做一些调查，你问老百姓，你们觉得民主是什么意思？一般来说，他们会说 government for the people， 是政府为人民服务，就是民主，而不一定是 government by the people。但是西方一般来说，民主的意思 is government by the people. That's the original meaning of the term, and that's the one that has had great influence till today. Actually, in Chinese, the translation 民主 is basically, it means government by the people, government as the masters, right? But in people's ordinary understandings, often it doesn't mean that. So I want you to think of democracy here in the way that it meant in an original sense of government by the people. The people control the government, okay, basically. That's the meaning of democracy. And we're going to see that in ancient Athens, it meant challenging, maybe even destroying some of these family and aristocratic clans. Let's go back to the very beginning. Why did democracy come about? And then we will ask why it was maintained. 为什么维持? Okay, so you have to remember ancient Greece was not a country, right? 不是国家. It was many city-states, okay? 是城邦制, right? In ancient Greece, polis. It was city-states, little cities, quite small cities, often had different forms of government. So in Plato's famous text, The Republic, 理想国, right? He was critical of democracy because he favored more the non-democratic political system in Sparta. Democracy came from a tiny city-state of Athens. And city, it doesn't mean it's like today, 城市. Half of it was rural. 也包括乡村, okay? Basically, it's a small city-state. Quite small, maybe 100,000 people, like 10万的人口, okay? 大部分是差不多. So we have to ask, why did democracy come from a tiny city-state called Athens? Why? Why did it come from there? And why was it maintained? And why did it eventually decline? Once we have a better understanding of that, of the history, then we can talk about what the nature of it, of the democracy, and what the institutions were. So the first question we have to ask, why did it come about? Why did democracy develop there and nowhere else? What were the special, 非常特色的情况？现在大家觉得，民主是普世价值观，当时是最最特色的价值观，很小的地方的政治制度，为什么在那个很小的地方有民主呢？而且为什么在很小的地方民主维持？ Why was it maintained? And then why did it decline? Well, the first is more like a little speculation. It's hard to prove. But basically, before democratic values institutions developed in ancient Athens, it was a bit like China in the sense that if you were older, you had more power. 权力与年龄有关系. But you had some young soldiers who thought, that's not fair, 这个不公平. And then they were upset and they took power from the elderly people, including the older soldiers, and then they implemented the principle that power or privilege should not depend on age. 他们觉得权力与年龄不应该有关系. So the power, political power, can be distributed regardless of age. Young people can also have political power. It was a new idea, and probably it's because you had some rebellious soldiers who just took power from those who were older, and they decided to implement this idea, okay? Probably that's how it happened. There's no clear kind of, it's not clear in history. What we do know from history is that there were great political leaders, 伟大的人物, 伟大的统治者, who implemented democratic reforms slowly until you had a much more fully democratic city-state. That means a city-state where the people, ordinary people, 一般的老百姓, had political power. That was a true innovation. And there's basically three great leaders, Solon, Cleisthenes, and Ephialtes. I don't speak ancient Greece, so I'm probably not pronouncing it correctly. But let's look at the reforms of each of these great statesmen or great political leaders. Solon is very famous for implementing economic reforms that provided a foundation for democracy. And here Marx and many other socialist thinkers are perfectly right, that you can't have equal power, or you can't have power to ordinary people if the economic structure is highly uneven, or if a tiny minority of rich people control resources. There has to be a rough equality economically. Only then can you have a rough equality politically, right? So, what Solon did, he freed the serfs, basically those who were controlled by aristocratic elites, and it led to an idea that all citizens are equal, and also equally important. If you want to have a good democracy, you need time for people to argue about politics and to think about politics, right? If you have, like in a modern state, many people criticize, for example, think of the United States where, 一般来说, 投票的人他们不会考虑太多一些跟政治有关系的问题，他们比较盲目按照他们的情感会投票，这个不行，对不对？理论上，我们讨论政治的问题应该是比较理性的讨论问题，然后我们然后才可以判断。So the condition for that is you need time， 需要时间，时间是最宝贵的东西，对不对？ If I'm a peasant and I spend all my time working in the fields, I don't have time to discuss about politics, right? Or if I'm a businessman who spends all my time making money, also I don't have time to think about politics. So what Solon did, he provided some economic reform that led to a mentality of equality, and more equally important, provided some leisure time, some time for ordinary citizens to think about politics and to argue about politics. That was so important as a foundation for democratic politics. He also implemented some political reforms. Who can be a political leader? Before, it was you had to be born in the right family. 跟家庭的背景有关系. He says, no, it doesn't depend on the family. What you need is a certain amount of money. So in that sense, it was more equal. Even if I'm from a poor family, but if I have a little bit of money, I can participate in politics. So it was a bit of a progress, democratic progress. And he also said he established an elected council of 400 people to prepare business for the assembly. So this was basically you were elected to an important council that prepared the decisions to be decided by the political assembly, and they were selected by elections. Invention of the elections also came from ancient Athens. He established popular law courts where anybody, ordinary citizen, can be part of the legal process. And the decisions of the law courts could be appealed. So it was similar to a modern, roughly similar to a modern idea of the rule of law, where if I'm unhappy with a decision at a lower court, I can appeal my decision. He also established some social reforms. And this is what I mean here by attacking the power of the family and the democracy. Or think of Chinese political thought. 墨子他对儒家他批评儒家对不对？为什么呢？ The same reason. He didn't like the fact that Confucians favored very elaborate funerals because he thought that was a waste of money, and he thought that people should be more devoted to the political community instead of their family. Same thing. He thought less emphasis on the family, more emphasis on the political community in the form of democracy. So less very expensive funerals, and also that you could, when you die, you could give your property to non-family members. Before him, when you died, it was more aristocratic idea. You give your property to the family. He says, no. It's very important to move people's hearts. It's 跟情感有关系, away from the family and to the political community. That was another foundation for democracy. The next great political leader who implemented democratic reforms was Cleisthenes. And he said, we need regular assembly meetings. You have to remember, democracy in Athens was direct democracy, 是直接民主, not indirect. If we are in ancient Athens, we are ordinary citizens, we all get together and we vote, and everybody's vote counts for the same as one. So we decide, do we want to go to war with Sparta? We decide ourselves. We don't have representatives who decide for us. But you need a lot of people. 30,000 应该是3万, 对不对? It could be up to 30,000, and a quorum of 1/5, that means you had to have a minimum of 6,000 citizens in the assembly to make decisions. Only then would it become law. So you needed 1/5 or 6,000 citizens in the assembly to decide on issues like whether to go to war with another city-state. And this was a big one, but he says you also need smaller political groupings, which he called tribes, like political subdivisions that are based on residence. So we would have like 鳌山卫的人口是多少？6万。OK， 那跟 Athens 差不多。所以鳌山卫 little parts of 鳌山卫 would each have their own little government, and then to discuss issues, and then the big assembly in 鳌山卫 literally would meet for major decisions. But below that, there would be, like if we live on the Shanda campus, we would have our own little political assembly, and then that would go eventually to the big assembly. And very important, again, is that these representatives of tribes. So if we are representing Shanda as part of Ao Shan Wei, we would serve on the council of 500 people that prepares work for the assembly. So we would ask the assembly to decide on issues. For example, do we go to war with Sparta? We would decide that, and then we would prepare work for the assembly on that very issue. The counselors of this Council of 500 served only twice in a lifetime for 1 year at a time. Not long. Why? So that every citizen could have the opportunity to participate in the highest political institutions of our community. 每个人都有机会可以参加 Ao Shan Wei 的议会. Okay, that's the basic idea. And basically why did he do that? Because he was worried by these people who were born into families and who had power. He says, we're going to take ordinary citizens, people, as partners to struggle against the aristocracy for power. And also, it was a bit like 有一点像战国时代. They're constantly fighting with other city-states. And if you had many citizens who were actively involved in politics, it was easier to mobilize them for military purposes too. There was also military reason. And some people say maybe he had some genuine democratic ideals. I mean, it's hard to prove, right? Another reformer, because some people, if they're poor, they would rather work in their fields than go to the assembly to participate in politics. So, what did the next political reformer do, or the next democratic reformer do? He introduced pay for members of the council and of the juries. So you would get paid to go participate in politics. That way you don't have to work as much or spend as much time with your family. And the members of the council, it's even more democratic, were selected by law, 抽签, not by elections. 今天在中国有一个很出名的学者王绍光，我们上个学期请他做讲座，他觉得抽签比选举更民主。其实古希腊的学者也这么想，对不对？ They thought if you organize people by lottery, by random selection, everybody has equal chance. It's more democratic than by voting, where if you're voting, if I have money, I could encourage people to vote for me, and it's less democratic. So he invented the idea of choosing people by lot. 他发明那个抽签的制度。And also, the juries in law courts increased in size. Okay, so that's the origin. That's the origin, right? But let's ask, why was it maintained? I mean, many people have great ideas, but then they do not have lasting influence, right? Why was democracy maintained in ancient Athens? In some senses, even more important than asking, why was it originated from Athens? Why did it have influence for hundreds of years? Why? Well, here, looking at 伟大的人物, great men, is not so useful. Now we have to look at the deeper social and economic reasons. This is maybe more of a Marxist analysis, but one that makes sense in this context to understand why democracy was maintained. The first, and this is not a good reason from a moral point of view, is that Athens was an empire. It was a huge, very wealthy, and almost bloodthirsty empire. They constantly fought wars, and they had power over colonies. When you think of the flow of tribute, it's very different than the kind of the tribute. 跟朝贡体系完全不一样. It was pure exploitation. They would take money from the colonies, money, gold, resources, to support the political system in Athens. Because to be a citizen, you had to be freed from work. Because if you work all the time, you don't have time to deliberate and to discuss politics. You have to be freed from work. How can you be freed from work? If you have material resources to support you, so you don't have to work. How do you have material resources? If you're an empire, by taking money and resources from your colonies, okay? And that's what happened. Athens was a great imperial power, and they had very important matters to discuss. That's why they could pay ordinary citizens to go to the assembly to discuss about politics, because they had money from the colonies. And also, because it was a very powerful empire, the rules of citizenship were tightened. You had smaller... Aristotle famously was not a Greek citizen. 用现在的语言，他没有户口, To have an Athenian huko was very, very valuable because it was a hugely powerful political community. So the rules of citizenship were tightened. That's why now the richest countries in the world now, think of Switzerland,瑞典, Norway. It's very hard to become a citizen because they're so rich, and right. So they have very restrictive rules for citizenship, similar as Athens. So all this tribute, the money, the minerals, the treasures that were sent by the colonies to the imperial power, it means that ordinary citizens had a lot of money as well, and there wasn't as much resentment against the rich. So you 可以减少贫富差距，对不对？因为通过这样的帝国的方式 okay? That's the first reason why it was maintained. Second reason, even worse from a moral point of view reason, it was a slavery system. 是奴隶的制度, okay? Every citizen had 2 slaves. So that's, from a political point of view, it's good in a way because I don't have to work. I could spend all my time in the assembly talking about politics or doing philosophy, because the slaves would do the necessary work for me. So remember, to be a good democratic citizen, you need money and you need time. The money came from the imperial conquests, and the time came from the slaves. The slaves did the necessary work. So the citizens had more leisure time for politics. That's why Aristotle famously provided a very dubious argument. He said slavery is natural for some people, that some people are slaves by nature. Whether he really believed that, we're not sure, because he liberated his slaves after he died, and he did say something very interesting, that if machines could do the work of slaves, then we won't need a slavery system. So he recognized slavery as an unfortunate necessity, but it's one that underpinned the democratic system in Athens. Finally, another bad reason, it was founded on the subordination of women. Not everybody could be a citizen. Only men could be citizens. Women were not citizens. 完全是大男子主义的制度, okay? So, at the family, who did the work? The women. So the men were totally free to participate in philosophy, or in politics, or to do philosophy or science, because the empire provided money, the slaves did the work outside the home, and the women did the work inside the home. So all the male people, all the male citizens of Athens had free time to discuss politics. That provided the foundation for a stable democracy. Of course, so think about it, if you lack these conditions, it's hard to have a good democracy, right? So it's a very unique system, very hard to reproduce elsewhere, where you have an empire, where you have a slave system, and where you have the almost total subordination of women to men. These are the three conditions that allowed for democracy to be maintained in ancient Athens. Of course, this is maybe a more positive factor. There really was a genuine element of patriotism. 他们真的，完全可以说是爱国，也不是爱国，因为是爱城主义，对不对？因为不是国家，是城市或者城邦，对不对？ very strong sense of pride. 那个你发给大家那个 Pericles' funeral oration. The only defense we have of democracy, which explains also why people were so proud of their democracy, was by a general, Pericles, who gave a funeral oration to soldiers. It was an oration in honor of soldiers for Athens who sacrificed their lives for the political community. 他们牺牲自己的生活. So it was a little speech. It's not long. I hope you can all read it. It was sent, right? It's a very short speech where he explains what makes democracy in Athens so powerful and so lovely, and why we should die for it. You know, that's what he wants to say. It's worth dying for. So he's very proud. 是非常强的爱国主义，很觉得牺牲自己的生活。为什么呢？ The first is that he said power is in the hands of the people. Of course, not including slaves, not including metrics 是没有户口的人, not including women. But basically, that's why if every ordinary citizen has the same amount of power, then this provides a great source of pride for people.